It's pretty obvious that different game masters and groups of players have their own preferences when it comes to TTRPGs. For example, lately there's been a big pop of a lot of systems that are more narrative focused, whereas I've seen a lot of games more from like the 90s that tend to be a lot crunchier and a little more simulationist in their approach. That being said, one of the things that I've personally found helpful as a game master is being clear about how I'm speaking about the player's interaction with a game. And for that, I use the term of 3 frames, something coined by researcher Gary Allen Fine in his 1983 book Shared Fantasy. Since learning about these 3 frames, this has become a really helpful tool for helping me figure out what my players' preferences are and being able to deliver an experience that matches it. And it can help clear up some things if you find that your players are getting maybe a little too immersed. Hi, I'm John, this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming, and today we're discussing the 3 frames of interaction in TTRPGs. Let's get into it. Okay, before getting too much into the weeds of everything, I want to start with an example of how the 3 frames of interaction and using that language may be helpful in the running of a game. When I first started getting into TTRPGs, I was invited to a 5th edition D&D game with a game master that I was familiar with. The setting was notably darker than anything we'd played before, and although I knew the GM, there were a lot of players that I was unfamiliar with. Well, the first 2 sessions made a very strong impression. I was really delighted by the fact that every player seemed to take their character seriously, thinking through their backstories and motivations, and it was clear that this campaign was designed to be more political intrigue, where the fun of the game was uncovering secrets, not only about the world, but about each other's characters. It was also a great early example of an experience that helped me clarify my personal mission when it came to TTRPGs, discovering our best selves using TTRPGs as a vehicle to do so. For example, in this darker world, some of the characters were choosing vengeance or selfish options, and they were justified in doing so. But personally, I tended to keep making heroic options even though they weren't necessarily the best or easiest options for my character. Kind of like The Witcher, this actually made these heroic moments even more meaningful because I was never sure if my character was actually going to make it out or not. For example, in our very first session, our party of level 1 player characters ended up fighting this really nasty level 5 enemy who definitely could have vaporized my character in one hit. One of the player characters, who was more cowardly and selfish, ended up running, and instead of judging them or blaming them, my character decided to cover their escape and go toe-to-toe with this nasty villain even though they could have died. Interestingly, though some of the other players enjoyed my participation, others accused me of metagaming, or in other words, using player-only knowledge to inform my character's decisions. The GM was quick to clarify that I was in fact not metagaming. I was speaking out of character as a way to clarify what my character knew so as to avoid my player knowledge impacting my character's choices. And this is where the 3 frames of interaction could have been really helpful language. In retrospect, a lot of these other players I was less familiar with were quote-unquote theater kids that didn't really separate their in-game acting from their player behavior. On one hand, this is one of the reasons why they seem to immerse so easily. But on the other, by being clear of my out-of-game and in-game conversations, it ended up creating a lot of friction that I think was ultimately unnecessary. In addition, there was a little bit of uncomfortable boundary crossing that not all of us had signed up for between the game's darker story and some of the characters designing backstory trauma for their characters that hit a little too close to home for some of us. There were definitely some rough spots that needed some smoothing over. But that's not to distract from the fact that I look back on this campaign rather fondly. The hills far outweighed the valleys, and overall I thought that this was an incredibly valuable educational experience to inform my game mastering moving forward. Now, to segue us into talking about the 3 frames of interaction, these 3 frames were terms coined by Gary Allen Fine, a researcher who was looking into the TTRPG phenomenon in the early 1980s, in the midst of the Satanic Panic, where the public was concerned that players were blurring the lines between fantasy and reality. Fine's research instead showed that in order to actually play and enjoy TTRPGs, players needed to be aware of 3 frames: the frame of the player, the system, and the character. What we ultimately can call frame 1, or the player, is you, the real world person enjoying and playing the game, perceiving the real space and time around you, and able to acknowledge that yes, we are just playing a game. We aren't actually elves, dwarves, vampires, whatever game you're playing. Frame 2 is the system. The mechanics that help structure the gameplay to move everything forward. And frame 3 is the character, using the theater of the mind to perceive an imaginary space, also what we may call in-game. Now, we can also use the term frame confusion when our understanding of these frames gets blurred. I think one of the easiest examples is when a player asks a question and the game master might be, oh, does your character say that? There have been plenty of times as a player, I go to ask a question as me, John, the player, and then the GM starts role-playing as if my character asked it, when it wouldn't have even made sense in the narrative. I think that a lot of tables, in pursuit of an immersive experience, make the mistake of trying to limit the number of frame 1 or frame 2 interaction instead of using them as points of clarification to inform what's happening in frame 3 or the fantasy world. For example, when I'm perusing Reddit, seeing how other game masters are giving out advice, a super common tip is talk to your players. Or in other words, don't ignore frame 1 as a way to solve problems that happen at your table. The zealous hatred of metagaming can in fact limit your enjoyment of a game if frame 1 is just completely ignored. After all, that is the reason we're playing, right? For us, the real people, to enjoy what we're actually doing. Whether it's playing in person or online, or through a forum, talking or through text, however you want to do it. From a GMing perspective, I also find it helpful to take a self-inventory of how often you utilize these 3 frames. The levels can be different for everyone, but it can also be a great way to kind of categorize how your players are thinking and how often they're thinking of each of these things in order to understand what they enjoy about playing, so that way you can maximize the enjoyment of a given experience. And maybe even build rosters for certain games you're excited to run in a more informed way. For example, if a player is frequently referencing the mechanics on their character sheet, I don't think that's a bad thing. It just indicates that something they may enjoy or at least are comfortable with are the game's rules and structures. I don't think that's something that they should be shamed for. I think that's something that you should be able to note to better inform how you speak to that player. Contrary to what some may believe, I don't think any of these frames are better than each other, but rather you're going to get the most out of your game by understanding your table's unique harmony between these frames. In fact, in some of my early game mastering experiences, I had players outright thank me for actually acknowledging frame 1 more so than some of my GMing peers. For example, if the party came upon a door, rather than saying, it seems untrapped, roll a perception check to keep them in frame 3, I would outright just say, hey, GM speaking here, this door isn't trapped. You can open the door and see what's beyond it. This was a case where I observed that my players did not enjoy the simulationist experience, and much of the time, the right move seemed to be to settle their fear that I was going to try to catch them and punish them for not checking the right thing, and instead try to highlight the more emotional, dramatic moments that they seem to enjoy for their characters. That being said, a related phenomena that I have personally experienced too many times to be able to dismiss is something called bleed, a term used to describe how skills or feelings may move between characters and their players. For example, one of the early campaigns that I ran as a GM was Horde of the Dragon Queen. In the early stages of the adventure, my players who had a decent knowledge of the rules felt powerful. They were great at blasting away cultists and making the main antagonist not really feel like a threat. So, upon visiting a village on their way between Greenest and their next objective, I had them travel through one of the player characters' hometowns described in their backstory. And I described how the village had been attacked by the cult, and the character's adoptive mother had perished during the raid. Well, the players decided to hold this really in-depth emotional funeral for this NPC that they'd never met. And there were a lot of real-world tears shed at the table that I hadn't predicted. It was one of the starkest moments where I realized there were real-world emotional benefits to playing TTRPGs. It wasn't until recently that I had heard of this term bleed to describe basically what my table felt that day. Now, I do believe that bleed is a phenomena. It is not a goal. It's not something you can really design to make happen, but it is something interesting to observe when it does happen. And I believe that it can yield a lot of beneficial insights. Like I said earlier, as a player, I found that when the chips are down, I'm probably going to make the selfless move. Whether that's a character that I've designed or a situation that happens in the real world. Knowing a character that I was excited to play was about to be vaporized by another character, I still would feel better about sacrificing them than about compromising their character by making a more selfish move. However, in that same game, other players believed that what I would call bleed was the goal, rather than just something that may or may not happen. And so, whereas the tear shed in the funeral scene designed by my players felt cathartic, a lot of times the tears felt about secrets getting uncovered by someone's character. They felt a little more problematic. In fact, I think bleed is something that's good to account for when you're designing a campaign or scenario. Again, not necessarily thinking of it as the goal, but rather understanding how some players may or may not be more sensitive to certain topics or content. For example, Marisha Ray, famous for playing several characters through Critical Role, in an Adventuring Academy podcast with Brennan Lee Mulligan, talked about how playing Keyleth made her feel like a better person. And in fact, a lot of Critical Role, it seems like there is more emotional harmony between the characters and the players than a lot of other more casual games. By contrast, in an interview with Call of Cthulhu creative director Mike Mason, Mason basically said, you really don't want a lot of emotional harmony between the player and the character in Call of Cthulhu. The fun is more about how there's a separation between player and character, and the player is distantly observing their character being frightened by eldritch horrors. I actually think either approach is okay, but I do think it behooves a table to at least acknowledge these elements so whatever choices they make are more informed. Which does bring me to the fourth frame. Now, I initially didn't stumble upon this frame concept through Shared Fantasy. Instead, it was a book called Tabletop Role-Playing Therapy by Megan A. Connell, who is specifically talking about how TTRPGs can be a beneficial tool in a clinical therapeutic setting. After she discussed the first three frames we've already covered, she talked about a fourth frame, the frame of therapy. Now, one of the warnings she establishes is attempting to use a frame of therapy without the guidance of a licensed clinician can be harmful to patients. Which, if you followed me for any length of time, you've heard me say again and again, I believe that TTRPGs can be therapeutic. They are not a substitute for therapy. This is, first of all, an acknowledgement that a trained, licensed therapist is going to be able to offer healing that your friendly neighborhood game master can't or shouldn't have to. But I also believe that simply playing TTRPGs does offer real tangible mental health benefits. If nothing else, then just the act of perspective taking, whether you're immersed or emotionally harmonized with your character or not. Which is why I personally love talking about a fourth frame in terms of personal growth and development rather than therapy. Here's the difference. The frame of therapy, as presented by Connell, is more about healing a psychological wound or about strengthening one's social skill set to alleviate the symptoms of a mental health struggle. For example, in her case study, she had patients with symptoms ranging from autism spectrum disorder to ADHD to just flat out social anxiety. And she was using Dungeons and Dragons as a safe imaginary space to help practice social skills to alleviate their discomfort in the real world. By contrast, a lot of my friends who have similar diagnoses instead acknowledge some personal insights they yield from playing TTRPGs, but it's more happenstance than targeted like the clinical environment that Connell talks about. The tone is a lot lighter. And again, it's mostly just practicing perspective taking, which creates the potential of increasing one's empathy. For example, I have a friend whose character grew up as a distrustful orphan. She had never been a distrustful orphan, but it did give her a unique perspective and a different way of thinking that increased her own empathy over others who may be distrustful themselves. I had another player who wanted to practice organization, so they intentionally played a complex class like a wizard in order to force them to create systems to help organize their thoughts a little more efficiently. It's not like they were so chronically disorganized that it was disruptive to their everyday life, but it was a little skill set that ended up making a big difference when it came to their own habits and proactivity. And of course, when I play, I frequently ask myself, how do I feel about the choices of my character? Is this a choice that I would also make, or is it something completely different? Are there insights about this that I can glean for myself so that I can live a more fulfilling, enjoyable life? Anyways, those are 3 to maybe 4 or 5 different frames that you can look at your TTRPG experience through. Now I want to hear what you have to say. What's your group's unique harmony between the 3 frames we talked about earlier? Are you intrigued by a 4th frame? Or do you think that's just baloney? And do you have any experiences with frame confusion? Let me know in the comments down below. Check out the description to hop into the playtest of my TTRPG system, Swiftguard. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.